My name is Lauren Castile. I am 29 years old. My parents never once asked me a single question about my own wedding. Not the venue, not the dress, not the date. They asked my fiancé's mother everything instead, and I didn't understand why until the night before my ceremony, when she sat me down and told me something that changed how I saw my own parents completely. I grew up outside Richmond, Virginia, the only daughter of my parents, Diane and Robert. I have one older brother, Patrick, who is 4 years ahead of me and was, by every measure I grew up watching, the center of our family's attention. Patrick was the one whose Little League games my father never missed, whose science fair projects my mother helped build until midnight, whose college acceptance letter got framed and hung in the hallway. I don't say this to suggest my childhood was miserable. It wasn't. My parents fed me, clothed me, showed up to my school events when their schedules allowed it. But there was always a baseline level of engagement with Patrick's life that never quite extended to mine. I told myself for years it was just the natural rhythm of a family with one of each, that maybe sons and fathers had a different kind of closeness, that maybe my mother and I were simply different kinds of people who loved each other in a quieter register. I met my fiancé Daniel 4 years ago at a continuing education class we were both taking after work, him for a project management certification, me for a marketing one. We started talking during break, kept talking after the class ended, and 2 years later he proposed on a hiking trail we'd done a dozen times by then, at the Overlook where we'd had our first real conversation about wanting kids someday. Daniel's family was different from mine in a way I noticed almost immediately. His mother, Susan, called him every Sunday. His father came to every single one of his soccer games growing up, even the away games 2 hours out. When Daniel told his parents we were engaged, his mother cried on the phone for what he said was a full 5 minutes before she could speak again. When I told my parents, my mother said, "That's wonderful, honey," and asked what night worked for everyone to get together for dinner sometime soon. My father said congratulations and asked if Daniel had a stable job. That was the extent of it. The engagement period was a year and a half. Susan started planning almost immediately, in the sense that she started asking questions. What kind of venue did I picture? Did I want a big wedding or something smaller? What season did I love most? She wasn't pushy about it. She just asked consistently, the way you'd expect a future mother-in-law excited about a wedding to ask. My own mother asked very little. When I mentioned we were looking at venues, she said that sounded nice. When I sent her photos of 3 dresses I was considering, she replied with a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. I told myself she was busy, that she expressed care differently, that not everyone gets emotional about weddings the way movies suggest they should. What confused me more was a pattern I started noticing about 6 months into planning. My mother had started calling Susan directly. Not often, but enough that I noticed it. Susan would mention, in passing, that my mother had asked about the catering company we'd chosen or whether we'd settled on a date yet. I found out about my own wedding's progress secondhand, through my future mother-in-law, more often than I heard about it from my own mother directly. I brought this up with my mother once, carefully, over the phone. I said something like, "I noticed you and Susan have been talking about the wedding stuff." She said, "Oh, she's just so easy to talk to about it. She has so many good ideas." I asked if she wanted to talk to me about it instead, since it was my wedding. She said, "Of course, honey. I just don't want to overwhelm you with my opinions." That answer didn't sit right with me, but I let it go, the way I'd let a lot of things go over the years. I told Daniel about it once, lying in bed, and he said something I've thought about a lot since. He said it seemed like maybe my parents had a way of loving from a distance that worked fine until the distance started costing something. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. As the wedding got closer, the pattern continued. My mother asked Susan whether the bridesmaid dresses had come in. She asked Susan about the seating chart. She even at one point asked Susan whether I seemed stressed, rather than asking me directly. Susan mentioned each of these conversations to me afterward, a little confused herself, clearly trying to be tactful about it without saying outright that something seemed off. I want to be honest that this hurt in a slow, accumulating way rather than one dramatic moment. Each individual instance was small enough to excuse. Taken together over a year and a half, it built into something heavier. I started to dread wedding planning conversations with my own mother because they always felt thin, like she was going through motions rather than genuinely present for something that mattered enormously to me. The week before the wedding, my mother flew in from Richmond along with my father, and we had a series of small gatherings, a rehearsal dinner, a final dress fitting, last-minute errands. Throughout all of it, I noticed her continuing to direct questions to Susan rather than to me, even when I was standing right there. At the rehearsal dinner, she asked Susan what time we needed to be at the venue the next day, while I was sitting 2 seats away. I didn't say anything that night. I had decided somewhere along the way that confronting my mother the week of my wedding wasn't worth the conflict it might create. I wanted my wedding day to be peaceful, and I told myself I would deal with whatever this pattern meant after the honeymoon, once things had settled. The night before the ceremony, I was at Daniel's parents' house for what was supposed to be a simple final fitting and a quiet dinner before the rehearsal the next morning. Susan asked if she could speak with me privately for a few minutes before dinner. We went into her sunroom, just the two of us, and she closed the door. She told me she'd been debating for months whether to say anything, and had decided that whatever discomfort it caused, I deserved to know before I walked down the aisle without understanding something important about my own family. She told me that about 2 years earlier, before Daniel and I had even gotten engaged, my mother had called her. Not for any wedding-related reason, since there was no wedding yet, but because the two of them had met at a parents' weekend event at the college Daniel and I had both attended years apart and had stayed loosely in touch since. During that call, my mother had told Susan something Susan had never repeated to anyone until that night. My mother told her that she had struggled significantly after I was born, a kind of postpartum depression that, in the era and circumstances she gave birth in, was barely acknowledged and never properly treated. She said the early months of my life were a blur of exhaustion and a kind of emotional numbness she didn't have words for at the time. By the time she came out the other side of it, I was already a toddler, and Patrick, 4 years older, had already absorbed most of the attachment and engagement she felt capable of giving during that period. She told Susan she had spent decades feeling a quiet, persistent guilt about the gap she felt had formed between us in those early years, a gap she didn't know how to close once it existed, because admitting to it would mean explaining why it was there, and explaining why it was there meant talking about a period of her life she had never fully processed or discussed with anyone, including my father. Susan told me my mother had said something specific that stayed with her. She said, "I don't know how to be close to Lauren without confessing to her that I failed her in a way I'm still ashamed of, and I don't know how to do that without breaking both of us." Susan said she hadn't known what to do with that information for 2 years. She wasn't going to volunteer it to me unprompted, since it wasn't hers to share. But once the wedding planning started, and she began to understand the gap I was describing in passing comments, she started to connect what my mother had told her years earlier to the distance Daniel and I had both noticed. She told me she didn't think my mother was avoiding the wedding planning because she didn't care. She thought my mother was avoiding it because being close to the most significant emotional moment of my adult life meant confronting feelings about closeness she'd never resolved, and it was easier to participate from a safe distance through Susan than to risk feeling that inadequacy directly with me. I sat in that sunroom for a long time after Susan finished talking. I didn't cry immediately. I felt something more like a slow rearrangement of years of memory, 100 small moments getting recontextualized in real time, the thumbs up emoji instead of a real response, the questions directed to Susan instead of me. None of it had been indifference. It had been avoidance built on a guilt my mother had never told me about. I asked Susan why she decided to tell me the night before my wedding, specifically, rather than earlier or later. She said she debated it for months and ultimately decided that walking down the aisle the next day without understanding this would mean I might misread my mother's behavior during the ceremony itself, the toasts, the moments parents are supposed to have with their children. She said she didn't want me carrying resentment into the one day that should be about happiness, without at least having the context to understand where the distance had actually come from. I didn't confront my mother that night. I went back to my own hotel room and sat with it instead, turning the conversation over for hours before I finally slept. The wedding itself happened the next day, and it was, despite everything, a genuinely good day. My mother gave a short toast that surprised me with how much emotion was in it, more than I'd seen from her in years. I watched her during it with new eyes, understanding for the first time that the distance I'd felt wasn't about how much she loved me, but about a wound she'd never let anyone help her carry. About 3 weeks after the honeymoon, I called my mother and asked if she would come to lunch with me, just the two of us, somewhere quiet. She said yes immediately, which itself surprised me given how often our one-on-one time over the years had been brief or deflected. At lunch, I told her that Susan had spoken to me the night before the wedding, and I told her what Susan had shared. I watched my mother's face go through something I'd genuinely never seen from her before, a kind of unguarded grief that she usually kept locked down completely. She confirmed everything Susan had told me. She told me, for the first time in my entire life, about those first 18 months after I was born, about days she couldn't get out of bed, about a doctor who told her she just needed more sleep and sent her home, about the way she watched herself go through the motions of caring for an infant while feeling like she was underwater the entire time. She told me that by the time she surfaced from it, Patrick was old enough to actively seek her attention in ways a toddler version of me simply couldn't, and the habits formed in that gap never fully closed, even after she felt like herself again. She told me she had wanted to tell me for years and had never found a way to start the conversation without it sounding like an excuse for decades of distance she knew I'd felt. She said avoiding the wedding planning hadn't been a conscious decision to push me away. It had been an old, automatic response to feeling inadequate around something that mattered to me deeply, the same response that had shaped so much of our relationship without either of us naming it directly. I told her I wished she had told me sooner, not to relieve her of responsibility for the distance, but because understanding the reason behind it changed how I was able to hold it. I told her I still felt the weight of years where I'd assumed she simply preferred my brother, and that feeling didn't disappear just because I now understood where it came from. But I also told her I was willing to build something different going forward, now that we weren't operating with this unspoken thing sitting between us. We've had lunch together every few weeks since then, just the two of us, something that never happened with any regularity before. She still isn't naturally effusive. That part of her hasn't changed and probably won't. When I learned that the distance I'd spent a lifetime quietly resenting wasn't built from indifference at all, it was built from a wound my mother had carried alone for nearly 3 decades, one she was too ashamed to name until someone outside our family finally said it for her. That is my story. One conversation in a sunroom, one truth my mother had carried silently for 30 years, and a relationship that finally had room to become something different. If this reminded you of distance in your own family that turned out to have a reason you never knew, drop it in the comments, share this with someone who needs to hear it, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.